Open your Bible, any Bible, King James, New International, English Standard, it does not matter which one you own. Turn to almost any page in the Old Testament, and somewhere on that page you will find four letters printed in small capitals, L-O-R-D. You have read that word 1,000 times, maybe 10,000. You have sung it in a hymn. You have seen it stitched into a needlepoint hanging in your grandmother's hallway. You have heard a preacher shout it from a pulpit on a Sunday morning, the whole congregation rising to their feet. But here is the question almost nobody ever stops to ask. Lord is not the word that was actually written on the original page, not in Hebrew, not on the scroll a scribe copied by lamplight 2,000 years ago. In the language this story was first told in, there is no word for Lord sitting in that spot. There is a name, four letters, Yod, He, Vav, He, a name that was written down nearly 7,000 times across the Hebrew Bible, more than any other name for God in the entire text, and yet a name that for most of recorded history, almost nobody has been allowed to say out loud. For over 2,000 years, one of the most repeated names in human history has been quietly hiding inside a translation, not erased, not destroyed, hidden in plain sight, underneath a title that most readers assume has always been the original word. And once you see what is actually sitting under those four capital letters, you will not be able to read a Bible the same way again. So stay with us, because today we are going to open up the four Hebrew letters that started this whole chain of translation, tradition, and quiet substitution, and we are going to follow that name all the way from a burning bush in the wilderness, through the scribes who guarded it, through the empires that translated it, and into the pulpit you may be sitting in front of this Sunday. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us, had you ever noticed those small capital letters before, and did you ever wonder why they were there? You are about to find out. To understand what is hiding under the word Lord, we have to go back to a mountainside, a burning bush that would not burn out, and a man named Moses, who was, by his own admission, in no position to be asking anyone for their name. According to the book of Exodus, Moses is tending sheep in the wilderness when he sees a bush on fire that never turns to ash. He approaches, and a voice speaks to him from the flame, telling him to go back to Egypt and free his people from slavery. Moses, understandably terrified and unsure of his own authority, asks a very practical question. If I go to the people and tell them the God of their ancestors sent me, and they ask me what this God's name is, what do I say? The answer he receives is strange, layered, and has occupied scholars and translators for well over 2,000 years. In Hebrew, the phrase is Ehyeh asher ehyeh, most often rendered in English as I am who I am, though many scholars argue a more accurate translation would be I will be what I will be. It is a name built directly on the Hebrew verb to be. It is less a label and more a declaration of existence itself, self-sufficient, self-defining, answerable to nothing outside itself. From that verbal root comes the name that will appear again and again throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. Four consonants, Yod, He, Vav, He. Scholars call it the Tetragrammaton, simply Greek for four letters. It is not a job description like king or shepherd or judge. It is not a category like God or Elohim. It is a proper name in the same way that your own name is a proper name, given at a specific moment to a specific person in a specific place. Here is what makes this genuinely remarkable. According to one well-known scholarly count, this four-letter name appears in the Hebrew Bible 6,828 times. That number is worth sitting with. It is used far more often than any other title or description for God in the entire text. This was not originally a minor detail buried in a footnote. This was the primary way the God of the Hebrew Bible was identified, by name, over and over again, thousands of times, across the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. And yet, almost nobody today can tell you with total certainty how it was actually pronounced. Ancient Hebrew was written only using consonants, no vowels at all. As long as the name was still spoken aloud on a regular basis, everyone simply knew which sounds belonged between those four letters. But as we are about to see, a tradition developed of avoiding speaking the name altogether, and once enough generations passed in silence, the exact vowel sounds slipped away. Today, most historians and linguists believe the closest reconstruction is something like Yahweh, based on early Greek transliterations and comparative study of related ancient languages. But even that remains an educated reconstruction, not a certainty. Sit with that for a moment. An entire civilization built a religious practice around protecting a name so completely for so many centuries that eventually even the memory of exactly how to say it began to fade. Is that devotion? Is that loss? Or is it both at once? Tell us what you think in the comments, because that tension is really the heart of everything we are about to walk through. So why would anyone stop saying a name that God Himself gave? The answer starts with one of the 10 Commandments. In the book of Exodus, the people of Israel are told, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Historically, Jewish tradition read this command with tremendous seriousness, not just as a ban on cursing or swearing falsely, but eventually as grounds for extreme caution around pronouncing the sacred name at all. Over the centuries, particularly during the Second Temple period, a practice developed among the Hebrew people of avoiding the spoken name entirely, out of reverence rather than fear. According to Jewish tradition, by a certain point only the high priest was permitted to pronounce the name aloud, and only once a year, on the holiest day of the calendar, inside the innermost chamber of the temple. For everyone else, in everyday reading, in prayer, and the synagogue, whenever the four letters appeared on the page, the reader would substitute another word entirely. That word was Adonai, Hebrew for my Lord or my Master. This is not a story of some outside force silencing a people's language. This substitution came from within the tradition itself as an act of protection born out of awe, the same instinct that many religious communities today avoid writing out certain sacred names in full, or that leads some people to write G-D instead of the full word God. The name was treated as too weighty for casual use, so a respectful substitute took its place in speech, even while the original name remained fully intact on the page. Centuries later, a group of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes set out to preserve the Hebrew Bible with total precision. Sometime around the 5th to 10th centuries after Christ, they developed a system of small marks, vowel points, to be added underneath the consonants of the Hebrew text, since the original writing had no vowels at all. When they reached the four letters of the sacred name, they made a very specific choice. Rather than write in the vowels that actually belonged to that name, since almost nobody alive still used them in speech, they inserted the vowel markings belonging to the word Adonai underneath the consonants Yod, He, Vav, He. In effect, this was a permanent written instruction to every future reader. Whatever consonants you see written here, say something else instead. Scholars call this practice cere perpetuum, roughly the permanently read substitution. It meant that the sacred name could remain fully preserved in writing, letter for letter, generation after generation, while its actual pronunciation was quietly and deliberately routed around out loud every single time. If you grew up in a Jewish household, or you have spent real time studying Torah, this practice may already be second nature to you. For everyone else hearing this for the first time, take a moment and think about what it actually means to build an entire reading tradition around saying one word while your eyes are looking at a completely different one. Let us know in the comments, is this still practiced today in the tradition you know? And what does that discipline mean to you personally? This is where the story leaves the world of Hebrew manuscripts and starts crossing borders, languages, and empires. And this is really where the word Lord, as we know it today, begins to take shape. Centuries before the time of Jesus, Jewish communities living in Greek-speaking cities, especially in Alexandria in Egypt, needed their scriptures translated into Greek, the common language of the day. The result was the Septuagint, one of the most influential translations in human history. When the Greek translators reached the 4 Hebrew letters of the sacred name, they followed the same oral custom already practiced by Hebrew-speaking readers. They did not attempt to transliterate the sound of the name at all. Instead, they rendered it as Kyrios, the ordinary Greek word for Lord or Master. The exact same substitution Hebrew readers were already making out loud in the synagogue. A few centuries later, the biblical scholar Jerome produced a Latin translation of the Scriptures known as the Vulgate, which would become the standard Bible of Western Christianity for well over 1,000 years. Jerome followed the same established pattern, rendering the sacred name as Dominus, Latin for Lord. So by the time Christianity spread across Europe, an entire continent of readers had inherited a translation tradition already several centuries deep, one in which a proper name had been consistently represented by a general title in language after language, without most readers ever realizing a specific personal name sat underneath it. When the Bible finally appeared in English, this pattern continued, and it picked up a few new twists along the way. The medieval scholar John Wycliffe, translating in the 14th century, rendered the name in some passages simply as Adonai. In Germany, the reformer Martin Luther chose to render it as Herr, German for Lord, and made a point of using capital letters to visually distinguish it from the ordinary word for a human lord. It was the English reformer William Tyndale who would leave the deepest mark on how English speakers encounter this name today. Tyndale began translating the Bible into English in the 1520s, working partly in exile, at a time when producing an English Bible outside of official church control was treated as a serious crime. He would eventually be executed for this work in 1536. Following the pattern Luther had already established in German, Tyndale rendered the sacred name in English as Lord, using capital letters to set it apart from an ordinary lowercase Lord. But Tyndale did something else that is easy to miss. In a handful of passages where he judged the specific meaning of the name itself to be essential to understanding the verse, he wrote it out directly instead of substituting a title. At Exodus chapter 6, verse 3, Tyndale became the first person to print the word Jehovah in English. That word was not some rediscovery of the ancient pronunciation. It was a hybrid, formed by taking the consonants Yod, He, Vav, He, and inserting the vowel sounds of Adonai in between them, essentially reverse engineering a pronounceable word out of a name that had deliberately been separated from its own vowels centuries earlier. It was, in a strange way, a byproduct of the very tradition of silence we just walked through, an attempt to give voice back to a name whose original sound had already slipped away. When a team of scholars commissioned by King James I completed their English translation in 1611, they followed Tyndale's convention almost completely. Wherever the 4 Hebrew letters appeared in the original text, they rendered it Lord in small capital letters, and they kept the word Jehovah in a small number of places, largely following Tyndale's earlier choices. Nearly every major English translation published since, from the Revised Version to the New International Version to the English Standard Version, has continued the same basic convention, Lord in small capital letters standing in for the personal name in the underlying Hebrew text. Do the math on that for a moment. That means for roughly 500 years, across dozens of denominations, hundreds of millions of printed Bibles, and an untold number of sermons, English-speaking readers have been encountering a title on the page in the exact place where the original Hebrew text placed a specific, personal name. Comment below, had you ever noticed the difference between Lord and Lord in your own Bible before today? If the answer is no, you are in very good company. So, what actually changes when a name becomes a title? On the surface, not much. The sentence still makes sense, the theology still holds together. Nobody reading Lord in their Bible is being deceived about who is being discussed. But underneath the surface, something quieter and harder to measure does shift, and it is worth naming honestly. A name is personal. It is particular. It locates one specific identity out of every other possible identity, and it typically carries the memory of a relationship, a moment, a history between the one who gives the name and the one who receives it. A title, on the other hand, is general by design. Lord can refer to a king. It can refer to a landowner. In the world of the King James translators, it could refer to any nobleman with authority over tenants. A title tells you about a role or a rank. A name tells you who, specifically, you are talking to. In the burning bush story, the giving of the name is presented as a deeply relational act. This is not a distant deity being described in the abstract. This is a being introducing itself by name to a specific person, tied to a specific people, a specific set of promises, a specific unfolding story stretching from Abraham through Moses and beyond. The name, Yahweh, throughout the Hebrew Bible functions less like an abstract category and more like a covenant partner's signature, appearing again and again at exactly the moments where that relationship is being reaffirmed. When that name is replaced consistently across 5 centuries of translation and hundreds of millions of printed pages with a general honorific, the sentence keeps functioning, but the texture underneath it changes. The reader no longer meets a name, they meet a rank. And ranks, by their very nature, feel a little more institutional, a little more distant, a little less like being spoken to directly, and a little more like being addressed through a title. Here is a question worth sitting with, and honestly worth arguing about in the comments below. Does calling on a name change the nature of a relationship compared to calling on a title? Think about the difference between calling your own father by his first name and calling him only Sir every single time for your entire life. Both are respectful, both are technically accurate, but most people would say they are not quite the same thing. This pattern, a name quietly reshaped as it crosses a language, a border, or a generation, is not unique to Scripture. It is one of the oldest and most human patterns in recorded history, and it shows up again and again far outside the Bible. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island had family names anglicized or simplified, sometimes by clerks who could not spell what they heard, sometimes by the immigrants themselves, hoping to blend in a little more easily. Enslaved people across the Americas were frequently stripped of their birth names entirely and given new ones by the people who claimed ownership over them. Colonizing powers renamed rivers, mountains, and entire nations to fit their own maps and their own tongues. Across history, names, personal names, tribal names, and yes, sacred names too, have often been reshaped as they move through the hands of translators, empires, and the simple passage of time. This matters here for a specific reason. For many communities across the African diaspora and throughout the Americas who trace a spiritual identity back through the Hebrew scriptures, whether through the ancient Beta Israel tradition of Ethiopia, various Hebrew Israelite movements, or Christian communities actively working to reclaim the Hebrew roots of their faith, the question of the original divine name is rarely treated as a dry historical footnote. It is treated as a piece of identity that was quietly set aside somewhere along the way and can be picked back up. We want to be very direct about something here. This video is not taking a position on which modern pronunciation is the correct one or which tradition holds the more authentic claim to this name. Sincere, careful scholars and devout communities disagree on those exact questions, and that disagreement deserves respect rather than a verdict from a YouTube video. What we are pointing to is something a little more foundational than any single answer. Translation is never a neutral, invisible act. Every single time a name crosses a language, a border, or a century, somebody, somewhere, makes a decision about what survives fully intact and what gets smoothed over for the convenience of the next generation of readers. Multiply that decision across 1,000 years, dozens of languages, and billions of readers, and you end up with one of the largest, quietest acts of editorial influence in human history. Not because any single translator was acting in bad faith. Most were doing exactly what their own tradition of reverence instructed them to do. But habit compounds, convention compounds, and after enough centuries, the substitute can start to feel more natural to a reader than the original ever was. If any part of this connects to your own family history, a name that got changed at a border crossing, shortened at a school registration desk, or quietly lost somewhere along the generations, tell us about it in the comments below. You might be surprised just how many people reading this thread have a very similar story sitting in their own family tree. Let's untangle a handful of names and words that get mixed up constantly, because knowing the difference actually makes the rest of this story click into place. Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, is the original 4 Hebrew consonants, the personal name revealed at the burning bush, appearing thousands of times throughout the Hebrew Bible and never fully spelled out with its own vowels in the traditional text. Yahweh is the modern scholarly reconstruction of how those 4 consonants were most likely pronounced in ancient times, based on early Greek transliterations and comparative study of related Semitic languages. It shows up today in certain scholarly writing and in a handful of Bible translations that have chosen to print the reconstructed name directly rather than substitute a title. Adonai is the Hebrew word for my Lord or my Master, the word Jewish readers have traditionally spoken aloud in place of the sacred name whenever it appears in the text, out of reverence rather than avoidance. Jehovah is an English hybrid formed centuries later by combining the consonants of the sacred name with the vowels belonging to Adonai. It first appeared in English through William Tyndale's translation, and it remains in active use today within certain traditions, most notably among Jehovah's Witnesses. Elohim is a separate and much broader Hebrew word, simply meaning God or gods. It is used throughout the Hebrew Bible, both for the God of Israel and, in a handful of other passages, for other divine or powerful beings entirely. In English translation, it is almost always rendered simply as God. And finally, Yeshua, a name meaning something close to salvation or the Lord saves. It is itself a shortened form of an older name, Yehoshua, the same root behind the name Joshua. When the story of a man bearing this name was later written down in Greek, it was transliterated as Jesus, which passed through Latin and eventually settled into English as Jesus. Same Hebrew root, 3 completely different languages, 3 noticeably different sounds, one more clear example of just how far a name can travel and how much its sound can shift without the identity underneath it actually changing at all. So tell us, which version did you personally grow up hearing? Yahweh, Jehovah, Adonai, or simply the Lord? Drop it in the comments below. We genuinely read every single one. Before we close this one out, we want to be completely clear about what this video is, and just as importantly, what it is not. This is not an argument against any Bible, any translation, or any faith tradition. Millions of people around the world find genuine meaning, comfort, and truth in the word Lord, printed exactly the way it has been printed for roughly 500 years. And understanding the history behind that word does not take that meaning away from anyone. What this video is, instead, is an invitation. An invitation to look a little more closely at a word you have probably read 1,000 times without a second thought, and to realize that underneath it sits an entire history of reverence, translation, empire building, and memory, all layered on top of one another across 3,000 years. Somewhere beneath every single Lord printed in small capital letters, there is still a name, 4 Hebrew letters, written down nearly 7,000 times, rarely spoken aloud, carried forward across centuries by scribes who guarded it, translators who reshaped it, and readers who chose, again and again, generation after generation, to protect it rather than let it disappear entirely from the page. Whether you walk away from this video seeing that as an act of devotion, an act of quiet loss, or something that honestly sits as a little bit of both, that is a question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If this is the first time you have really stopped to think about the 4 letters sitting underneath the word Lord, type the words "the name" in the comments below and let us know you made it to the end. And if enough of you do, the next video in this series is going to take you further, into the name Yeshua itself, into how Hebrew names survived, shifted, and resurfaced across African and diaspora languages and traditions, and into the parts of this story we simply did not have time to cover today. Until then, we'll see you in the next one.